want to love me? You just told me that you love me for the first time, and I want to say I love you too. But there are so many things going through my mind, I'm a little nervous. Because I want to ask you, are you sure that you do? Are you sure you want to love me?
Eureka Beats.
Okay, darling, I commend. You know there are difficult times there. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against that. That we are always smart, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against that. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against that. That no one can against that. So come on, of course, darling, everyone is here, they want us. Of course, darling, they are after us, but they can't. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that those are difficult times. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against us, that they are after us. They are searching us. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that church and soccer together. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, and they want communist or socialist Jews. Of course, darling, that is the world from today. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, and so is life. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, but what can you do without the state? Of course, we are so in debt, darling. Of course, population without representation and things like those. Of course, darling, we are done, but okay, what can we do against those?
You know I love you. I'm sorry that I said I didn't earlier. The one thing I knew would hurt you. I'm sorry. But you know I love you. And I know that you love me too. It's just that...
Of course, darling, my grandfather was a boxer in the radio when everything began. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that he was the fox on the radio. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. And then they shot him with a chew gun. Of course, darling, my grandfather was a hero. Of course, darling, they shot him with a chew gun. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. But okay, that is what you can see here, that so was life. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. But okay, what can we do against that? He was a hero and they shot him with a chew gun to erase him from the map. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, that is what you can see. But okay, what can we do against those? Just nothing. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. That so was life then. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. Of course, and when I was born, they tried to cut me so I don't make the same things as my grandfather. Of course, darling, they tried to cut me, of course, and hang me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they give me a lot of heroin and things like those. Of course, they hang me, darling, and things like those. Of course, darling, so was it then. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that they tried to cut me so I don't do the same things as my grandfather, and they gave me a lot of heroin and hang me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have here. Of course, darling, so was it then. So what can I do against that? Just nothing. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. Okay, so it's life here, of course, darling, but I forget about all of them. Of course, darling, everything, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, this is out on my path. Of course, this is
Eureka
out on my
Beats.
passing through. Of course, darling, they wanna hang me, but I have to deal inside. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, but no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. John, you know that, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I am gonna kick down, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, darling, that is what you can have, of course, darling, everyone after me, but they can't against me, so what are you gonna do? Of course, darling, absolutely nothing, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they want me to be their father from God or things like those, but I'm not in the mood, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm gonna kick John in the face, of course, darling. Of course, darling, give me some money for Halloween for which take. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Give me some money, of course, darling, we're gonna dance. No one can against us, you know that, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that everyone knows. 7, 9, 11, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that everyone knows it. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they kidnap my kids and put him there with the Lena movement, of course, darling, and I just let the snake go out, of course, darling, that is what she can have, so they are scared of me, of course, darling. I just wanted to be a little bit more brave than them, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so what are you gonna say? Of course, darling, that is what you can say, that no one can against me, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we are here, that no one can against us, of course, darling, that no one can against us, so what are you gonna say? Of course, darling, I'm gonna forget about all them, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm gonna kick John in the face, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, darling, give me some money for Halloween, which take, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us, of course, darling, a kiss, and bye.